In 1495, the city of Naples in Italy faced a terrifying epidemic unlike anything people had ever seen. They called it many names: the French disease, the Spanish itch, or even God's punishment. But today, we simply know it as syphilis. Everywhere, streets were filled with cries of pain. Victims suffered terribly, covered with painful sores, swollen wounds, and disfigured faces. Doctors had no idea how to treat it. Joseph Grunpeck, who witnessed the outbreak firsthand, described it as a nightmare disease. People developed ulcers that started in private areas and spread quickly across their entire bodies. The pain was unbearable, and many thought it was punishment from God for their sins. At that time, people were afraid and superstitious. No one doubted where the disease had come from. Christopher Columbus, who had just returned from exploring America, was immediately blamed. Columbus and his crew were accused of unknowingly bringing this deadly infection back from the New World. For the next 500 years, most of the world accepted this belief that Columbus and Native Americans were responsible for introducing syphilis to Europe. But history often hides surprising truths. One day, in a quiet town called Hull, in England, archaeologists discovered something unexpected buried beneath an old monastery: the skeleton of a man who had died more than 600 years ago. This skeleton, known simply as 1216, had clear signs of syphilis holes and marks on his skull that scientists couldn't ignore. Here was the problem. If this man had syphilis long before Columbus even set foot in America, it meant that Columbus and Native Americans were innocent. It raised a shocking question: who actually brought this devastating disease to Europe? This discovery launched a global investigation involving historians, doctors, and archaeologists. Everyone began to question if we had misunderstood history all along, but the skeleton in Hull was just the start. More evidence soon appeared from ancient Greece and Pompeii, where archaeologists found children's bones with signs of syphilis thousands of years old. This new evidence forced us to ask, if syphilis had been in Europe for centuries, why did it suddenly turn deadly in 1495? The answer lies in understanding how diseases evolve and spread. Syphilis existed quietly for thousands of years. However, when certain social conditions appeared, such as crowded cities, international trade, and changing lifestyles, the disease became much more dangerous. It turns out that our misunderstanding of history, our prejudices, and our quick blame created a harmful illusion. We unfairly blamed innocent people, ignoring the true cause of this suffering. Now, with the truth finally revealed, how will we face this new understanding? Can we learn valuable lessons from the syphilis outbreak of 1495 to help us deal with diseases in the future? Join me on this fascinating journey as we finally uncover the truth about who really brought syphilis to Europe. In 1493, when Christopher Columbus triumphantly returned to Spain after his extraordinary voyage across the Atlantic, Europe celebrated him as a hero, a brave explorer who had unlocked the gateway to the New World. Crowds cheered as exotic animals, vibrant plants, precious metals, and strange artifacts were paraded through bustling streets. Yet unbeknownst to anyone, another kind of cargo had supposedly stowed away aboard Columbus's ships. A devastating illness that would soon spread terror across the continent: syphilis. When the disease exploded in Naples in 1495, Europe was thrown into panic. Doctors, baffled and helpless, watched as victims succumbed to painful sores, excruciating bone pain, grotesque deformities, and unbearable suffering. Without scientific understanding or medical explanations, people turned instinctively toward superstition and blame. They needed a culprit to ease their fear, someone to shoulder responsibility for this unexpected plague. Columbus and his sailors became ideal scapegoats. After all, hadn't they just returned from distant, mysterious lands inhabited by people the Europeans viewed with suspicion? Columbus's voyage marked the first substantial contact between Europe and the Americas, and Europeans quickly concluded the explorers had contracted the disease through immoral interactions with native populations. Thus began a narrative that would endure for centuries, one blaming Native Americans for infecting the morally upright Europeans. This narrative spread rapidly, Portuguese physician Redies de Isla claimed he had treated Columbus's crew for symptoms resembling syphilis shortly after their return. Diaz de Isla's claim lent powerful credibility to the theory. And soon, history books began recording Columbus's expedition as the moment syphilis first reached European shores. The disease became linked indelibly with Columbus's legacy, overshadowing his great achievement in discovery with the stain of bringing an unprecedented scourge upon humanity. The consequences of this historical judgment were profound, enduring far beyond mere accusations. Native Americans were stigmatized as carriers of disease, painted unfairly as morally corrupt and inherently dangerous. For centuries, they bore the cultural shame and burden of supposedly introducing syphilis to an unsuspecting, innocent Europe. But history, when examined closely, rarely offers such simple answers. The discovery in Hull, England, a skeleton known simply as 1216, challenged this long-held belief. Scientists, historians, and archaeologists were forced to reconsider the accepted narrative when confronted by irrefutable evidence. Clear signs of syphilitic damage on bones buried in Europe more than a century before Columbus's famous journey. Yet, even as the evidence mounted against the Columbus theory, why did it persist for so long? To understand this, we must delve into the deeper psychological and social forces at play. In late 15th century Europe, society was deeply religious and heavily moralistic. Disease was viewed as divine punishment, inflicted upon sinners by a vengeful God. Syphilis, with its terrifying symptoms and sexual transmission, fit neatly into this worldview, fueling prejudice, stigma, and judgment.
All Europeans
desperately wanted to believe that this punishment originated from elsewhere, from uncivilized foreigners, rather than acknowledging it might already exist among their own communities. Moreover, Columbus's journey occurred at precisely the right moment to become scapegoated. The rapid spread of the disease coincided with Columbus's return, creating an unfortunate but convenient chronological alignment. Fearful populations seized upon this coincidence eagerly, ignoring more nuanced explanations or conflicting evidence. But if Columbus wasn't responsible, and syphilis existed in Europe long before his voyage, then how did the disease escalate into the deadly epidemic of 1495? The answer is found in understanding how pathogens evolve. Syphilis, like many diseases, existed in different forms for millennia, likely circulating quietly through human populations in a relatively mild state. Archaeological findings from ancient Greece, Rome, and even Pompeii indicate that signs of congenital syphilis were present well before Columbus was born. What changed in the late 15th century was not the introduction of a new disease, but a shift in human behavior and living conditions. As Europe's population grew and urbanized, cities became crowded centers of trade and commerce, filled with sailors, soldiers, merchants, and prostitutes, all key elements that allowed diseases to mutate and spread rapidly. The syphilis bacterium, responding to these conditions, adapted into a far more virulent and dangerous strain, slightly transmitted through sexual contact. The explosion in Naples was less a sudden introduction of a foreign plague and more a perfect storm of social, environmental, and biological factors converging at a critical moment. Blaming Columbus simplified this complex interplay, absolving Europeans from acknowledging the uncomfortable reality of their own societal choices and behaviors that enabled the disease's deadly emergence. Today, historians, epidemiologists, and anthropologists agree overwhelmingly that syphilis predates Columbus's voyage. DNA evidence, skeletal analyses, and historical documents consistently undermine the long-held Columbus theory. Yet, this correction to history has been slow to penetrate popular consciousness. The stigma and misunderstanding linger stubbornly, influencing cultural perceptions and prejudices even in contemporary times. Understanding the mistake made centuries ago isn't merely an academic exercise. It holds practical lessons for today. Historical scapegoating distracts society from addressing real causes and solutions. When blame is cast unjustly, It blinds us from deeper truths and more effective responses. Had European society looked inward rather than outward in blame, could they have better managed the epidemic of 1495? Reflecting on Columbus's wrongful accusation compels us to reconsider our tendencies toward blaming others in times of crisis. We see parallels in modern pandemics, where fear and confusion lead societies to unfairly stigmatize certain groups, places, or peoples. Recognizing how history was distorted in the past can help us guard against repeating these injustices. Thus, the story of Columbus and syphilis isn't simply about correcting historical misinformation, it's about confronting our enduring human biases, fears, and prejudices. It challenges us to be courageous enough to question accepted truths, humble enough to admit our mistakes, and wise enough to learn from history. As the evidence from skeleton 1216 in Hull shows, and as numerous archaeological findings across Europe confirm, Columbus was no more responsible for introducing syphilis than he was for inventing sailing itself. The truth, nuanced and complex, reminds us that diseases, like humans, are shaped profoundly by the environments we create and the choices we make. So let us finally release Columbus from the chains of historical blame. Let us remember him as an explorer who, though flawed and controversial in many ways, did not intentionally or inadvertently deliver this disease to Europe's shores. The true culprit behind the 1495 syphilis epidemic was not Columbus or Native Americans, it was humanity itself, blind to its own vulnerabilities, quick to judge, hesitant to embrace difficult truths. As we unravel this ancient mystery, perhaps, we will learn something even more valuable: how to prevent history from repeating itself. In the peaceful coastal town of Hull, England, beneath the bustling streets filled with modern traffic, archaeologists carefully excavated what, initially, seemed an ordinary medieval site. They were expecting to uncover pottery, fragments of medieval walls, perhaps remnants of daily life from centuries past. But buried beneath the foundations of an ancient Augustinian monastery, something astonishing awaited them. One skeleton, catalogued simply as 1216, would challenge centuries of historical belief. Archaeologists noted something strange from the outset. Skeleton 1216 had distinctive lesions on the skull small, circular depressions and perforations clearly visible to the naked eye. Such damage was unmistakably indicative of advanced stage syphilis, a diagnosis confirmed by leading paleopathologists. Initially, researchers approached these findings with skepticism. After all, if skeleton 1216 truly suffered from syphilis, this discovery would disrupt the widely accepted theory that Columbus had introduced the disease from the Americas. Carefully, the bones were sent to specialists at the University of Bradford, where experts in ancient diseases meticulously examined every lesion. Dr. Charlotte Roberts, a renowned paleopathologist, closely studied the bones. She explained that syphilis leaves clear and undeniable traces on skeletal remains, especially on the skull and long bones. The holes in the skull, known medically as caricica, and the rough, malformed limbs often called saber shins, offered undeniable proof. Dr. Roberts soon announced a groundbreaking conclusion. Skeleton 1216 had undoubtedly suffered from syphilis, and more strikingly, had died long before Columbus had even dreamed of crossing the Atlantic. This revelation immediately sparked fierce debate within historical and scientific communities. Could history have been so fundamentally misunderstood for centuries? Had Europe, in fact, harbored syphilis long before Columbus's famous voyage? Or was Hull's discovery merely an anomaly, a single mysterious exception? Seeking answers, researchers widened their search. They began combing through historical records and archaeological findings across Europe. Evidence began emerging from other locations. 2. Skeletons in medieval graveyards elsewhere in Britain, remains uncovered in France and Italy, and even from burial sites in Eastern Europe. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Syphilis appeared sporadically, but consistently, across Europe long before Columbus ever sailed westward. The whole discovery was more than a historical curiosity. It became a cornerstone for rewriting the narrative of disease transmission. But if syphilis had indeed lurked quietly in Europe for centuries, Why did it suddenly transform into the devastating epidemic of Naples in 1495? To answer this, archaeologists dug deeper, exploring historical contexts. The whole monastery itself offered intriguing clues. Augustinian friars were known as healers, caregivers, and respected figures within their communities, yet historical. Documents hinted at a more complicated truth. While dedicated to a life of poverty and chastity, friars often lived amid temptation in bustling ports and trade centers, exposed to a diverse and constantly changing population. Moreover, Hull had become a crucial trade hub by the late medieval period. Importing goods and hosting merchants from all corners of Europe, this environment provided the ideal breeding ground for a disease to spread and evolve. Further excavations at Hull revealed additional, unsettling clues. Skeletons buried nearby showed similar syphilitic signs, suggesting the disease was not isolated to a single individual. Moreover, these burials weren't relegated to obscure corners of the cemetery. They occupied positions of respect near the monastery's altar. This indicated victims weren't stigmatized outcasts, but prominent community members, further challenging the idea that syphilis originated solely as an exotic foreign plague. As the investigation expanded, more discoveries surfaced from even earlier times. In Pompeii, the famous city preserved by volcanic ash, archaeological records had quietly documented similar bone lesions for decades, though previously overlooked or misunderstood. Ancient Greek colonies in southern Italy also yielded skeletal evidence of syphilis, with some child remains exhibiting dental deformities, consistent with congenital transmission of the disease. Each new discovery painted a clearer picture. Syphilis was deeply rooted in European history, possibly dating back thousands of years, shifting and mutating quietly beneath the surface. But what triggered its dramatic transformation into a catastrophic epidemic? The answer lay in understanding syphilis as a disease capable of adaptation. The bacterium responsible Treponema pallidum evolves differently depending on its environment. In small, rural communities, the disease persisted in mild, non-sexually transmitted forms, often affecting people in childhood. However, as Europe became increasingly urbanized, connected by international trade and populated by large, dense communities, the bacterium mutated. It adapted to conditions where casual, non-sexual transmission became difficult, transforming into a sexually transmitted, highly virulent strain capable of rapid and devastating spread. Hull's archaeological evidence provided critical insight into this evolutionary journey. The bustling trade networks, combined with changing sexual behaviors in urban ports, facilitated this dramatic shift. Thus, the 1495 Naples outbreak represented not the arrival of a new disease, but the explosive resurgence of an old one, adapted to the urbanized, globalizing world. Yet, even as scholars pieced together this new narrative, resistance persisted. Many historians, conditioned by centuries of accepted wisdom, remained skeptical. They demanded more definitive evidence, radiocarbon dating, DNA tests, and further archaeological excavation. In response, scientists employed advanced dating techniques. To confirm skeleton 1216's age, radiocarbon tests conclusively dated the remains between 1300 and 1420. Nearly a century before Columbus's voyage, genetic studies followed, confirming the disease's presence in other pre-Columbian European skeletons. Each scientific step reinforced Hull's findings, gradually overcoming historical skepticism. Slowly, the long-standing narrative began to collapse under overwhelming evidence. Columbus, previously condemned by history as the inadvertent spreader of syphilis, emerged innocent. The disease that devastated Naples, which spread fear and stigma across Europe, quietly existed long before European ships ever set sail westward. Yet, confronting this revised history raised uncomfortable questions. Why did Europeans find it easier to blame outsiders rather than face the complexities within their own societies? Hull Skeleton 1216 forced us not only to reassess historical timelines, but also to confront deeper human tendencies toward scapegoating and prejudice. Ultimately, the archaeological revelations from Hull and beyond provided far more than historical correction. They offered powerful insights into human psychology, societal evolution, and disease dynamics. Understanding how syphilis evolved and why it became an epidemic teaches vital lessons relevant today. It warns us against hasty conclusions, prejudicial judgments, and simplistic explanations in the face of complex crises. As the bones speak, they remind us history is rarely straightforward. The past is filled with hidden truths, misunderstood narratives, and uncomfortable realities. Hall's discovery urges us to look beyond convenient scapegoats, to question long-held beliefs, and to embrace the uncomfortable complexity of human history. Only by accepting this nuanced understanding can we learn effectively from the past. Only then can we hope to respond more wisely to future epidemics, challenges, and crises. Skeleton 1216, once a nameless, forgotten victim, has now become a powerful voice reminding us to seek truth, compassion, and understanding in the face of fear and uncertainty. As the revelations from Hull began reshaping historical understanding, another archaeological shockwave rippled through the Mediterranean. In places long thought unrelated to Europe's infamous epidemic, the sun-kissed ruins of Pompeii and the weathered settlements of ancient Greece. For decades, Pompeii, frozen in volcanic ash since Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79, captivated historians. With its eerie, remarkably preserved scenes of daily Roman life, yet it wasn't the luxurious villas or haunting plaster casts of its doomed inhabitants that would offer historians a stunning new insight into the origins of syphilis. It was the unassuming, skeletal remains of Pompeii's less fortunate citizens. Meche and Renata Henberg, renowned bioarchaeologists, dedicated years examining these bones, seeking clues hidden deep within them. They scrutinized each skeleton meticulously, expecting to uncover familiar diseases common to ancient urban populations. But gradually, puzzling and startling signs began to emerge. Bone lesions unmistakably reminiscent of advanced syphilis appeared in multiple skeletons, some adults, and crucially, children whose tiny, fragile teeth exhibited defects indicative of congenital infection. Initially skeptical, Meche hesitated. Revisiting the evidence repeatedly, certain he must be mistaken. Syphilis in ancient Pompeii seemed impossible, almost unthinkable. But the physical evidence was undeniable. The telltale lesions, irregularities on skulls, misshapen long bones, and distinct dental deformities matched perfectly the devastating symptoms characteristic of advanced-stage venereal syphilis, Renata's. Findings confirmed her husband's fears. She carefully analyzed teeth from Pompeian children's remains, discovering a distinctive horizontal groove, a dental anomaly known as Hutchinson's teeth, indicative of congenital syphilis transmitted from infected mothers to unborn babies. The discovery was shocking. This ancient disease, assumed to have entered Europe in the late 15th century, had silently plagued Roman communities nearly 1,400 years earlier. But Pompeii wasn't an isolated case, inspired by the startling findings. Archaeologists expanded their searches throughout the ancient Mediterranean. They soon turned their attention to Metapontum, an ancient Greek colony located in southern Italy. Excavations there revealed equally troubling evidence. Numerous skeletons, dating back to around 600 BC, displayed identical syphilitic markers. The Metapontum skeletons provided indisputable proof of syphilis's presence in classical antiquity. Skeletal remains, again primarily from infants and young children, exhibited the same congenital dental abnormalities seen in Pompeii. Archaeologists, historians, and scientists had no choice but to conclude that syphilis had quietly circulated among ancient European populations for centuries, possibly even millennia, before exploding into public consciousness in the late 1400s. Yet this revelation raised a troubling paradox. If syphilis had persisted quietly in Europe since antiquity, why did it erupt into a catastrophic epidemic in Naples in 1495? Could the answer lie in societal transformations rather than external introductions of disease? To unravel this mystery, researchers dove deeper into historical texts and cultural contexts. They discovered that both Pompeii and Metapontum were vibrant ports, bustling crossroads of commerce and culture where merchants, sailors, and travelers mingled freely. Historically, ports and trade hubs often witnessed not only exchanges of goods, but also pathogens. It's facilitated by transient populations and social practices. But the question remained. Why hadn't syphilis triggered epidemics in ancient Pompeii or Metapontum, comparable to Naples in 1495? The answer, intriguingly, was rooted in the disease's evolutionary adaptability. Historical epidemiologists explain that syphilis, caused by the bacterium Treponema pallidum, existed historically in multiple forms. In less dense populations with frequent skin-to-skin contact and lower hygiene standards, the bacterium thrived as a mild, chronic, non-sexually transmitted skin disease, uncomfortable but rarely lethal. Yet as societies urbanized, becoming more hygienic, people wore clothes more consistently and adopted social practices minimizing casual skin contact. Under these changed conditions, Treponema pallidum was forced to adapt or risk extinction. Thus, it evolved into a sexually transmitted pathogen, infecting warm, intimate areas of the body, ensuring transmission even in more controlled, hygienic environments. The evolution didn't occur overnight, but over centuries, quietly adapting in urban environments like Pompeii and Metapontum. By the late Middle Ages, conditions were ripe for an explosive transformation. Increasing international travel, crowded urban centers, and changing sexual behaviors allowed the newly adapted sexually transmitted form of syphilis to spread rapidly. And devastatingly, ironically, Columbus's return in 1493 merely coincided with a tipping point when this evolving disease finally erupted into widespread public consciousness. Europeans lacking knowledge of syphilis's ancient roots mistakenly assumed it had arrived from overseas, blaming unfamiliar cultures rather than their own societal changes. This historical misinterpretation, although understandable given the circumstances, tragically fostered prejudice and misunderstanding that persisted for centuries, stigmatizing indigenous American populations unfairly. Today, the archaeological evidence from Pompeii and ancient Greece forces a profound reevaluation. Syphilis was never a sudden, foreign import. It was Europe's own hidden disease, evolving quietly over generations. The disease had always been there, lingering unnoticed, waiting patiently until social and cultural shifts provided an ideal environment for transformation and spread. Recognizing this nuanced history compels us to reconsider modern responses to disease outbreaks. Historical misattributions of blame can obscure true underlying causes, hindering effective responses. The Pompeii and Metapontum discoveries reveal how deeply diseases intertwine with human culture and behavior, reminding us that to truly understand, prevent future epidemics, we must examine not only pathogens themselves, but also our societies, habits, and attitudes. The ancient skeletons, silent for thousands of years, now speak loudly and clearly. Their voices challenge our preconceptions, compel us to acknowledge uncomfortable truths, and urge us toward greater humility, empathy, and understanding. They remind us that diseases, like history itself, evolve within complex ecosystems, biological, cultural, and social, defying simplistic explanations or convenient scapegoating. Thus, as we peel back layers of historical misunderstanding, we gain not only deeper knowledge of the past, but powerful insights into our present and future. Learn that disease origins matter less than our responses to them. Compassion, understanding, and honest self-reflection offer far greater tools against epidemics than fear, prejudice, or blame. Pompeii's buried streets and Metapontum's ancient graves now speak of more than tragedy. They offer valuable, timeless lessons. They show us that confronting epidemics requires not just scientific innovation, but cultural awareness and social responsibility. As we finally listen to these ancient voices, perhaps we will better equip ourselves to face the challenges still awaiting us. In this newfound clarity, syphilis's story becomes not merely one of historical correction, but of profound human wisdom. The bones of ancient Rome and Greece remind us to see beyond disease as purely medical phenomena. They teach us to approach outbreaks as mirrors reflecting deeper human truths about fear, blame, prejudice, resilience, adaptation, and ultimately about ourselves. With archaeological evidence from whole Pompeii and ancient Greece conclusively demonstrating syphilis's presence in Europe long before Columbus. Scientists and historians confronted another vital question. If syphilis existed quietly in Europe for thousands of years, why did it suddenly erupt into a deadly epidemic at the end of the 15th century? To unravel this mystery, we must first understand the nature of syphilis itself. Syphilis is caused by the bacterium Treponema pallidum, an adaptable organism capable of changing according to environmental conditions and human behaviors. For centuries, Treponema pallidum existed in a mild form known as endemic syphilis, or YAS, spread through casual, non-sexual skin contact. It persisted quietly in rural, isolated communities, causing minor skin conditions and rarely resulting in severe illness. However, during the medieval period, Europe underwent profound social transformations. Urbanization dramatically altered daily life. Towns and cities flourished, growing crowded with merchants, travelers, sailors, and soldiers moving constantly through trade routes connecting distant lands. These crowded urban centers significantly changed human interactions. People increasingly wore clothes, reduced casual physical contact, and adopted improved hygiene practices, inadvertently forcing the bacterium to adapt or vanish. Faced with extinction, the adaptable Treponema pallidum evolved, finding a new route for survival: sexual transmission. This shift allowed the bacterium to thrive in cities, where casual skin-to-skin contact had diminished, but sexual encounters both consensual and transactional were common and widespread. Ports like Naples, Toul, and Marseille became ideal hotspots for this transformed, sexually transmitted version of syphilis. Such cities bustled with diverse transient populations, fostering environments perfect for the rapid and deadly spread of the disease. By the late 1400s, syphilis had completed its evolutionary transformation, emerging fully as a severe sexually transmitted illness capable of devastating populations quickly and efficiently. Historians also discovered a crucial trigger in the siege of Naples in 1495. Armies comprising mercenaries and soldiers from across Europe, isolated from families and communities, engaged extensively with local sex workers. This widespread sexual activity created an ideal scenario for rapidly spreading the newly evolved, highly virulent strain of syphilis. Soldiers returning home across Europe inadvertently carried the disease with them, igniting an unprecedented continental epidemic, yet the cultural response compounded the disaster. Europe in the 15th century was profoundly religious, associating illness with moral wrongdoing. When syphilis, a visibly grotesque and sexually transmitted disease, exploded into public view, it was viewed as divine punishment, intensifying stigma and fear. Victims often faced abandonment, ostracization, and isolation. The transformation of syphilis from a quiet endemic disease into a catastrophic epidemic was not merely biological, it was deeply intertwined with societal shifts and cultural beliefs. Understanding this reveals critical insights. Epidemics emerge not just from pathogens but from human behaviors, social conditions, and cultural attitudes. Diseases adapt and evolve precisely because we adapt and evolve. Our cities' lifestyles, prejudices, and moral judgments shape the pathogens around us. This historical understanding carries powerful implications today, teaching us to approach epidemics with greater cultural awareness and societal responsibility. It warns against simplistic explanations or convenient scapegoating, urging instead comprehensive, compassionate, and holistic responses. For over 5 centuries, indigenous peoples of the Americas carried the unjust burden of blame for introducing syphilis to Europe. Historical accounts branded them as the originators of the disease, labeling them morally inferior and dangerous. This stigma compounded generations of suffering, discrimination, and misunderstanding, creating a lasting injustice that shaped relationships between Europeans and native populations. Yet, The new archaeological and scientific revelations tell a strikingly different story. Indigenous Americans were not perpetrators, but victims, not only of European prejudice, but also of devastating biological consequences. When Columbus's ships arrived, they carried diseases unknown to the Americas: smallpox, measles, influenza, and others. These old-world pathogens decimated native populations, killing millions and destroying entire communities. This tragedy dramatically disrupted traditional social structures, eroding vital cultural practices, including those that had previously kept endemic syphilis mild and manageable within native societies. Historically, indigenous American populations had experienced syphilis in its mild, non-sexually transmitted form for generations, building community-wide immunity from childhood infections. With the catastrophic loss of life from newly introduced European diseases, however, this protective cycle broke down. Subsequent European explorers, traders, and colonists brought back to the Americas the sexually transmitted, already severely weakened and culturally fragmented by earlier epidemics, proved tragically vulnerable to this deadly strain. Ironically, rather than spreading syphilis to Europeans, indigenous communities suffered greatly from the transformed European or originated strain. The devastating irony was profound. The very people historically blamed for introducing syphilis to Europe became its ultimate victims, decimated by a pathogen whose lethal form was incubated within European cities. This historical injustice demonstrates a painful human tendency when facing fear and uncertainty. The false narrative linking indigenous populations to syphilis persisted largely because it was convenient and comfortable, allowing Europeans to project moral anxieties outward rather than examine their own complicity and responsibility. Confronting this uncomfortable historical truth, we gain more than factual correction. We acquire powerful lessons on empathy, humility, and accountability. Recognizing the deep injustice inflicted upon native populations compels us to re-examine modern prejudices and biases. How often do contemporary societies unfairly blame minorities, migrants, or marginalized groups for disease outbreaks or social crises? History reveals clearly that such prejudices are rarely accurate and always harmful. The corrected story of syphilis also underscores the importance of addressing epidemics comprehensively. It urges us to integrate social justice into public health responses, acknowledging how social inequality, prejudice, and misunderstanding can exacerbate health crises. Addressing pandemics effectively demands not only medical solutions, but also cultural awareness, historical honesty, and societal compassion. Ultimately, the true victims of the historical misunderstandings surrounding syphilis were those unjustly blamed indigenous populations enduring stigma, prejudice, and further devastation. Yet paradoxically, the truth now emerging offers a form of redemption. By confronting our historical mistakes, acknowledging the injustice inflicted upon innocent victims, and learning vital lessons about humanity, prejudice, and disease, we may finally begin to heal historical wounds. Skeleton 1216 from Hall. The children of Pompeii, the ancient Greeks of Metapontum, and the indigenous peoples of the Americas, all silent victims of histories, prejudices, and misunderstandings, now speak clearly through archaeological discoveries. They remind us to embrace humility, compassion, and understanding. Teaches us that responsibility for epidemics belongs to no single person, group, or continent. Instead, it belongs collectively to all humanity. By acknowledging this, we transform painful history into invaluable wisdom, equipping ourselves better to confront future epidemics with justice, empathy, and effectiveness. Thus, the journey from ancient graves in Hull to Pompeii in ancient Greece becomes more than historical correction. It is a moral awakening, a powerful call to confront human vulnerabilities, prejudices, and responsibilities honestly and courageously. Only by accepting this difficult but illuminating truth can we truly learn from our past, guiding ourselves toward a wiser, more compassionate, more resilient future. The story of Syphilis once, a tale of blame, misunderstanding, and fear, has become one of insight, empathy, and profound historical truth. As archaeologists uncovered the silent testimonies of Hull's skeleton 1216, they delivered an urgent reminder of our shared humanity. Epidemics are not merely biological phenomena, but reflections of society's choices, beliefs, and biases. Through understanding syphilis's complex journey, we learn to approach future outbreaks with greater wisdom, humility, and compassion. History's greatest tragedy wasn't just the disease itself, but our collective rush to blame, stigmatize, and simplify complex truths. Let these ancient bones serve as enduring witnesses, challenging us to face difficult realities without fear or prejudice, and to always seek empathy over accusation. Ultimately, the truth behind who brought syphilis to Europe no longer matters. As much as the lessons learned along the way, the disease was shaped by humanity itself, evolving alongside societies in flux. Thus, our best defense against future epidemics lies not only in science but in cultivating a deeper understanding of our social responsibilities and collective vulnerabilities. May the voices from these ancient graves guide us toward a future where fear is met with compassion, blame replaced by understanding, and history's hard lessons inspire a wiser, more humane response to the challenges yet to come.